The tragic reality of Dickie Moore is a documented history of severe psychological exploitation. Forced to financially support his family as an 11-month-old infant, his entire identity was manufactured by Hollywood studios. The machinery of Hollywood did not simply discard him at puberty, it aggressively managed his decline. After wringing the final margins of profit from his awkward adolescence, the system conscripted the young man into the violent, cynical shadows of film noir. Once the monetizable novelty of the former child prodigy completely expired, he was quietly, clinically liquidated. Stripped of his identity and lacking basic social conditioning, he fell into chronic alcoholism and severe depression to cope with the abandonment. This is the cold physical reality of childhood monetization. The year is 1927. Inside a sprawling, dust-choked soundstage at United Artists, the heavy metallic gears of a massive hand-cranked camera begin to grind. The production is a silent cinematic epic titled The Beloved Rogue. The theater marquees across the country will eventually bear the name of John Barrymore, a towering figure of theatrical royalty, a man whose profile is synonymous with dramatic prestige. But the sprawling script requires a visual anchor, a brief, fleeting glimpse into the origin of his character to establish the timeline before the real, heavily compensated acting begins. The studio executives do not seek a child with agency, natural talent, or understanding. They require a specific physical mold, a miniature breathing replica. An 11-month-old infant is carried through the heavy wooden doors of the soundstage and placed directly under the blistering, unforgiving heat of the carbon arc lamps. He cannot walk without the steadying hand of an adult. He cannot speak a single recognizable word. He possesses absolutely no concept of his own identity, his location, or the financial machinery operating in the shadows just beyond the camera's lens. Yet the exact moment the cinematographer focuses the glass lens on his face, the raw, unformed material of a human life is instantly, legally, and permanently converted into corporate property. Far from a sudden stroke of Hollywood magic or a fairy tale discovery, this transaction functions strictly as the calculated clinical acquisition of a living asset. In the ledgers of the studio accountants, John Richard Moore Jr. is systematically erased. The infant is stripped of his natural familial context and rebranded. Dickie is manufactured. The physical reality of a 1920s film set is a deeply hostile environment for any grown man, let alone a newborn whose immune system and sensory processing are barely developed. The unventilated air inside the hangar-like structure hangs heavy and thick, with the toxic metallic scent of early film processing chemicals, burning dust, and stale tobacco smoke. The primitive lighting rigs necessary to expose the slow-speed film stock of the era operate like miniature aggressive suns. They generate a suffocating, blistering heat, routinely pushing the ambient temperature on the sound stage well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Into this industrial furnace, the 11-month-old infant is positioned like an inanimate prop. If he cries naturally, expressing the fundamental biological discomfort of a baby trapped in an extreme environment, it is deemed a ruined take. Time is money, and the infant is immediately hushed, repositioned, and forced to endure. If he looks away from the blinding, searing glare of the lamps, expensive film stock is wasted. From his very first conscious moments on Earth, before his brain can even process object permanence. His neural pathways are violently wired to understand a terrifying, unnatural dynamic. His physical comfort, his natural instincts, and his basic bodily autonomy are entirely subordinate to the commands of strangers peering through glass lenses. He is taught through silent, repetitive conditioning that his body is not his own. It is a rented, heavily insured space managed by towering adults who evaluate his worth exclusively through his ability to remain still, compliant, and photogenic on command. The commercialization of his fundamental human rights begins before he can even form a complete thought. As the calendar turns and the silent era violently collapses to make way for the talkies, the demands of the studio system evolve with ruthless speed. The microphone boom descends from the rafters, a new mechanical dictator hanging just out of frame. The infant transitions into a toddler, and the Hollywood machine realizes that his extreme youth, combined with a sudden, desperate, industry-wide need for clear audio, is a highly lucrative novelty. By the time he reaches the age of 6, the expectations placed upon his small, narrow shoulders defy basic developmental logic and border on psychological abuse. A heavy leather-bound script is dropped onto his lap. Replacing the expected picture books of childhood, this heavy binder contains precisely 1,707 words of complex, adult-written dialogue that he is contractually obligated to perform flawlessly on camera. The studio's publicity department, a well-oiled machine of fabrication, immediately spins this grueling reality into a glowing, easily digestible narrative of natural genius. Press releases flood the newspapers from coast to coast, selling the American public on the myth of a Hollywood prodigy. They paint the picture of a brilliant, exceptional boy who effortlessly absorbs and memorizes pages of text, a miniature intellectual marvel. The public consumes the lie eagerly. The absolute truth hidden behind the locked iron gates and the armed security guards of the studio lots is far darker. Stripped of the organic, joyful brilliance of a gifted child exploring his imagination, the rehearsal process devolves into pure, unadulterated intellectual coercion. In cramped, poorly lit dressing rooms, smelling of grease paint and cold coffee, agonizing hours are spent relentlessly drilling lines into a rapidly developing brain through sheer mechanical repetition. The 6-year-old child is forced into a state of extreme cognitive overload. The adults surrounding him, dialogue coaches, directors, and anxious stage parents, do not foster his intellect. They program it like a piece of early machinery. He is forced to memorize vast, unnatural sequences of dialogue written by cynical men 3 times his age, mimicking cadences, inflections, and emotional registers he cannot possibly comprehend. The underlying threat is always present, hovering in the heavy, suffocating silence of a blown audio take. Forgetting a single word, stumbling over a complex syllable costs the studio thousands of dollars in wasted film, ruined lighting setups, and idle crew time. The 6-year-old boy is made acutely, terrifyingly aware of this financial mathematics. His mind is treated as a biological storage drive, formatted strictly for industrial use. A moment of natural childish distraction, looking at a passing bird, losing focus due to sheer exhaustion, or simply forgetting a line, is treated not as a mistake, but as a catastrophic professional failure. The natural, chaotic, beautiful curiosity of childhood is systematically starved, replaced entirely by the crushing anxiety of the looming camera lens and the flashing red recording light. This relentless crushing pressure is locked permanently into place by a terrifying economic reality unfolding beyond the studio walls. The calendar turns into the early 1930s, and the Great Depression crashes over the American landscape like a tidal wave of despair. Outside the heavily guarded gates of the film studios, society is violently fracturing. Endless gray bread lines stretch around city blocks. Adult men, stripped of their pride, their savings, and their livelihoods, desperately search for loose change in the gutters, riding the rails in a frantic bid just to survive another week. The national economy is bleeding out, leaving millions destitute. Yet inside the insulated, heavily fortified, artificial world of Hollywood, the financial dynamics are grotesquely inverted. A 7-year-old boy whose primary concern should be learning to ride a bicycle is handed a weekly studio paycheck for $525. In the context of the early 1930s, when a grown, able-bodied man might be lucky to earn $15 for a week of back-breaking manual labor, $525 is a staggering, almost incomprehensible sum of money. It is a massive financial life preserver thrown into a drowning, desperate household. But this sudden, overwhelming wealth is the ultimate inescapable trap. The exact moment that first studio check clears the bank, the child ceases to be a son. He is instantly, irrevocably transformed into the sole economic engine of his entire extended family. The natural, protective, biological dynamic of the household completely collapses under the weight of the studio money. His parents undergo a terrifying metamorphosis, transitioning from traditional guardians into anxious, dependent managers. Their own financial survival, their elevated social status, the food on their table, and their ability to keep the roof of a beautiful Los Angeles home over their heads become entirely tethered to a 7-year-old's ability to hit a taped mark on the soundstage floor and smile on command. If the boy is too exhausted to work, the family risks starvation and the loss of their estate. If he falls out of favor with the casting directors, the entire domestic empire crumbles. He sits at the head of the dinner table, his small legs dangling above the floor, and looks across the room. He no longer sees protectors, he sees dependents. The adults who are biologically mandated to shield him from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the world are now the very people enforcing his labor, terrified of upsetting the delicate balance of their survival. At 7 years old, he is effectively isolated on a lonely, terrifying island of his own making. He carries the crushing, unyielding burden of patriarchal responsibility that would fracture the psychology of a grown man, moving silently through the motions of a manufactured childhood while dragging the heavy, invisible iron chains of a studio contract. The heavy soundproof doors of the soundstage seal shut, locking out the relentless California sun and trapping the stagnant air inside a cavernous, dust-filled hangar. On the surface of the celluloid, this controlled environment is routinely projected into darkened theaters as an idyllic, sun-drenched American utopia. Audiences nationwide purchase tickets to witness the chaotic, joyful anarchy of neighborhood children roaming free, their faces smudged with dirt, their laughter ringing pure and true. But the reality operating just inches behind the camera lens is a sterile, heavily guarded, and deeply cynical compound. There is no anarchy here. Every single laugh is mathematically calculated, every stumble is precisely choreographed, and every child is locked in a silent, brutal war for economic survival. The industry does not require children. It requires highly compliant emotional radiators. The machinery demands specific, intense human emotions on a rigid, unforgiving schedule, and the men operating the levers do not care how those emotions are mined from the bedrock of a developing psyche. A soundstage in the early 1930s. The production schedule is running dangerously behind. The script demands a scene of profound hysterical sorrow from its pint-sized star. A young Dickie Moore is placed firmly on his taped mark on the wooden floor. The carbon arc lamps beat down on his fragile shoulders, generating a suffocating physical weight. He is entirely exhausted. His small reserves of energy have been brutally depleted by hours of repetitive takes, blinding lights, and the heavy, stifling wool of his costume. The director, a towering, authoritative figure named Archie Mayo, demands tears. Not an imitation of sadness, but raw, visceral weeping. The boy, drained, numb, and psychologically detached from the fictional scenario, simply cannot produce them. His eyes remain dry. The heavy, expensive silence of the crew settles over the room like a thick fog. Money is burning with every passing second of delay. The executives pacing in the shadows check their pocket watches. Bypassing any instinct to kneel, coax, or offer a gentle word of encouragement, Archie Mayo refuses to grant even a fractional moment of rest. The Hollywood system does not operate on empathy. It operates on results. Mayo executes a calculated, devastating psychological strike. He suddenly turns his back on the camera, breaking the professional boundary, and violently attacks Dickie's mother, who is standing quietly on the periphery of the set. Mayo's voice echoes off the high acoustic walls, screaming at the woman with terrifying volume. His face contorts into a mask of fabricated, unhinged rage. He physically looms over her, threatening her presence on the lot, verbally dismantling the boy's absolute, only remaining symbol of safety, love, and protection. The child watches his mother being verbally annihilated by a towering stranger. The fundamental foundation of his entire world violently cracks and shatters into a million pieces. Lacking the cognitive capacity to recognize a theatrical performance or comprehend the ruthless mechanics of directorial manipulation, genuine, unadulterated panic completely floods his small nervous system. His chest heaves, his breath catches in his throat, and the tears finally begin to fall. They are violent, heavy, and choked with absolute terror. He is crying for his mother, crying out of a primal fear that his universe is collapsing. The exact moment the child breaks, Mayo instantly drops the terrifying facade. His face relaxes into a cold, professional mask. He snaps his fingers. The massive camera gears immediately engage. The lens captures the raw, traumatized sobbing of a boy who legitimately believes his life is being destroyed. It is a perfect, flawless take. Once the director calls cut, the heavy tension in the room evaporates. The adult crew members applaud the performance. Mayo smiles. The child is left trembling on his taped mark, hyperventilating in the cold aftermath of a manufactured trauma. The lesson is permanently, violently etched into his developing brain. In this industry, terror is just another highly valued tool, and his personal pain is merely a prop to be forcefully extracted by any means necessary. The adults surrounding him are not protectors. They are predators, feeding on his emotional collateral. This relentless extraction extends far beyond emotional manipulation, aggressively and clinically compromising the physical boundaries of the child's own body. The studio requires the absolute illusion of suspended innocence. Biology, however, is an unstoppable force. At the age of 6, Dickie Moore encounters a standard universal milestone of human development. A baby tooth becomes loose and eventually falls out, leaving a natural, endearing gap in his smile. In a normal household, this is a moment of quiet celebration, a visit from the tooth fairy, a hallmark of growing up. Inside the executive boardrooms of the studio, the lost tooth is treated as a catastrophic production emergency. A missing tooth shatters the heavily branded, highly lucrative illusion of the perfect child. It is a glaring, unacceptable visual reminder to the audience that the commodity is aging. The solution is swift, painful, and entirely unnatural. The boy is pulled from the soundstage and marched into a sterile, brightly lit dental office, paid for by the production. He is not there for health care. He is there for industrial maintenance. The studio dentist forces a thick, suffocating mold into the child's mouth to take an impression of his gums. From this mold, a rigid, uncomfortable prosthetic device, a flipper, is manufactured. It is a false tooth attached to a hard plastic pallet designed to wedge tightly against the roof of his mouth. The 6-year-old boy is forced to wear this unnatural apparatus every single time he steps in front of the camera. The plastic cuts into his tender, developing gums. It triggers a constant, nauseating gag reflex. It alters the natural shape of his mouth and makes swallowing difficult. Yet the director yells action, and the boy is contractually obligated to smile. He must project radiant, unblemished joy while a sharp piece of foreign plastic slices into his tissue, tasting the faint metallic tang of his own blood. The smile captured on the silver screen, the exact smile that melts the hearts of millions of paying adults across the globe, is a complete and total fabrication. It is an act of physical endurance masquerading as innocence. The studio successfully hides the reality of his developing body, forcing him to physically embody a stagnant, fictional version of childhood. His own biology is deemed unacceptable for public consumption. He is a living, breathing doll, modified and mutilated to fit the precise dimensions of a corporate mold, learning very early that his flesh, his tears, and his smile belong entirely to the men holding the contracts. The biological rebellion does not begin on a soundstage. It begins in the suffocating quiet of a child's bedroom in the mid-1930s. The boy is 9 years old. The heat radiating from his skin is not the artificial, blistering burn of the carbon arc lamps he has known since infancy. It is a violent, internal fire. A severe fever spikes, carrying with it a terrifying, aggressive rash that spreads across his chest and limbs. The diagnosis is scarlet fever, a highly contagious and dangerous bacterial infection. In a normal household, this medical crisis would be met with profound parental terror and singular focus on the child's survival. In the heavily leveraged household of a primary Hollywood breadwinner, A biological illness is not treated as a family tragedy. It is treated as a catastrophic breach of contract. Instead of traditional floral arrangements or sympathy, the studio executives deploy a barrage of anxious inquiries strictly concerning the compromised shooting schedule. The infection is not merely attacking the boy's immune system. It is aggressively attacking the studio's financial projections. As the fever rages, the bacteria aggressively targets the delicate porous bone structure directly behind his ear. The diagnosis escalates to mastoiditis, requiring immediate, highly invasive surgical intervention. The transition from the manicured artificial backlots of Hollywood to the stark, unforgiving reality of a hospital ward is absolute. A 9-year-old Dickie Moore lies on a narrow, starched mattress. The room smells sharply of iodine, rubbing alcohol, and fear. Doctors in heavy white coats circle the bed, their expressions grim. To save his life and halt the infection from breaching his brain, they must operate on the skull. But before the cold steel of the surgical instruments can even touch his skin, a far more symbolic mutilation must occur. The nurses bring out heavy metal clippers. For nearly a decade, the boy's thick, dark, perfectly styled hair had been his ultimate cinematic trademark. It was a carefully managed asset, brushed, pomaded, and lit by the finest cinematographers in the world to project an aura of flawless cherubic innocence. Now the mechanical clippers bite into his scalp. The hair falls away in thick, lifeless clumps, dropping onto the cold linoleum floor of the hospital room. As his scalp is shaved completely bare, exposing the fragile, vulnerable curve of his skull, the illusion of the immortal Hollywood child is violently stripped away. He is no longer a magical, screen-dwelling entity. He is just a sick, fragile, terrified little boy. The surgery is brutal. The doctors drill directly into the infected bone behind his ear. He survives the procedure, waking to the dull, throbbing agony of a fractured skull and heavy, suffocating bandages wrapped tightly around his head. But the true devastation occurs weeks later, when the fever finally breaks and the boy attempts to return to the only world he has ever known. He walks back through the heavy iron gates of the studio. He is frail. His face is pale and drawn, stripped of the manufactured radiance the cameras require. His head is shaved, bearing the angry red scar of the surgeon's drill. He steps into the casting offices, expecting the warm, paternal embraces he has received since he was a toddler. Instead, he is met with a chilling, absolute silence. The studio executives, men who had previously patted his head and handed him massive weekly paychecks, now look at him with undisguised clinical detachment. They do not see a brave child who has just survived a brush with death. They look at the bald head, the sunken eyes, and the surgical scar, and they see a defective product. He is damaged goods. The visual continuity of his highly lucrative brand has been broken. The unwritten, unspoken rule of the studio system is instantly enforced. Hollywood does not tolerate the physical reality of illness, and it certainly does not pay for it. The financial retaliation is swift and merciless. Contracts are quietly but aggressively slashed. The leading roles evaporate, replaced by the crushing silence of a telephone that suddenly refuses to ring. The boy, who had single-handedly carried the crushing weight of his family's entire economic survival through the darkest years of the Great Depression, realizes with terrifying clarity that his intrinsic human value is absolutely zero. He is only loved, he is only protected, and he is only wanted when his physical appearance can be monetized. The moment his biology falters, he is thrown onto the scrap heap of the dream factory without a second thought. This brutal medical exile violently accelerates his collision with the ultimate unforgivable sin of a child star, puberty. As the calendar pushes forward into his early teenage years, his body undergoes a natural, unstoppable metamorphosis. The round, highly marketable cheeks begin to collapse, giving way to the sharp, angular architecture of an adult jawline. The high, piping, innocent voice that had flawlessly delivered thousands of lines of manufactured dialogue suddenly betrays him, cracking and deepening into a harsh, unfamiliar baritone. He is rapidly growing too tall to be framed looking up adorably at leading men. Yet he remains far too young and physically slight to hold a revolver or command a romantic lead. He is trapped in the awkward age, a biological purgatory where the industry simply has no use for him. He has spent his entire conscious life impersonating a child, but the physical machinery of his own body is actively destroying the costume. Desperate to survive, desperate to find a place in the only ecosystem he understands, he attempts a psychological rebellion. He realizes that to survive as a man, he must legally and publicly execute the child. He walks into the expansive wood-paneled office of a high-ranking studio executive. The room is designed to intimidate, smelling of expensive leather, stale tobacco smoke, and absolute corporate power. He sits in a massive chair across from the heavy mahogany desk. He's no longer the 7-year-old prodigy. He's a young man, acutely aware of his change in biology, desperately attempting to reclaim the stolen fragments of his own identity. He looks directly across the desk and makes a quiet, precise, deeply human request. Please call me Dick Moore. Maintaining an unbroken focus on his paperwork without yielding a single sympathetic smile, the executive delivers the refusal with the chilling mechanical indifference of a bank teller denying a loan. The name Dick Moore possesses absolutely zero marquee value. It does not exist in the public consciousness. Dickie is the registered trademark. Dickie is the product the public has paid to see. The system brutally informs him that he is permanently trapped inside a diminutive suffix. They demand that the growing, mutating human being conform strictly to the stagnant fictional trademark, completely ignoring the absolute biological impossibility of the command. The industry formally refuses to acknowledge his progression into adulthood. They deny him the fundamental, unalienable human right to grow up, demanding he wear the psychological skin of an infant forever. He leaves the executive office completely defeated, carrying a name that feels like a suffocating straitjacket. The rejection initiates the final agonizing phase of his descent. Los Angeles, the early 1940s. The blinding, searing heat of the carbon arc lamps has been replaced by the dull, flickering, institutional hum of fluorescent lighting. A teenage boy stands rigidly behind a long glass counter in a vast, echoing department store. He is wearing a stiff, heavily starched, deeply uncomfortable wool uniform. His hands, which once held props alongside the greatest cinematic legends of the 20th century, now meticulously align rows of tin cars, wooden blocks, and brightly colored board games on metal shelves. The air smells sharply of industrial floor wax and cheap synthetic perfume. The erasure is absolute. Shoppers drift aimlessly past his counter. Mothers drag their young children down the brightly lit aisles, their eyes gliding over the teenage clerk without a single solitary flicker of recognition. Just a few short years prior, this exact same boy commanded a staggering salary, his meticulously lit face plastered on colossal, towering billboards across the globe. His manufactured smile had dictated the hairstyles, the clothing, and the cultural imagination of an entire generation. Now, his reality has been violently compressed into the metallic, repetitive click of a retail cash register. He reaches across the counter, taking crinkled, sweat-stained dollar bills from indifferent strangers. He hands back heavy copper pennies and silver dimes. He stands in the aisle, surrounded by the plastic, hollow artifacts of childhood, ringing up the very toys that he was strictly forbidden from playing with during his own youth. He watches other children completely unburdened by mortgages, contracts, or the terrifying demands of adult directors, tear carelessly into the packaging of the games he is selling. The contrast is physically nauseating. He is an exile in his own hometown. The transition from a global icon, the savior of his family's economy, to a completely invisible retail ghost is complete. The Hollywood machine had ruthlessly extracted his childhood, wrung every last cent of profit from his innocence. And the exact moment his biology betrayed the illusion, they discarded him into the crushing, humiliating anonymity of the real world. He stands under the fluorescent purgatory of the department store, a perfectly functional human being who has been legally classified as industrial waste. Exiting the suffocating fluorescent purgatory of retail did not offer a gentle reintegration into society. Instead, being abruptly ejected into the brutal, unscripted anonymity of civilian adulthood triggered an unrestrained psychological freefall. The Second World War offers a brief, chaotic illusion of escape. Millions of young men are shipped overseas, swallowed entirely by the military-industrial complex. For Dickie Moore, putting on a standard-issue military uniform offers a strange, unprecedented comfort. For the very first time in his conscious existence, he is wearing clothing that was not specifically tailored by a studio wardrobe department. He is just another serial number, a face lost in a vast sea of olive drab. But the global conflict eventually ceases. The troops return home. The marching band stop playing and the ticker tape is swept from the city streets. Before completely discarding him, the industry orchestrates one final grim extraction. By 1947, at 22 years old, the system pulls the young man into the deep, cynical shadows of film noir, casting him as a deaf mute in a violent crime thriller. It is a dark, poetic cruelty. The boy whose innocent voice had generated fortunes is now contractually obligated to remain completely silent while the adults enact lethal violence around him. Only after wringing out this final margin of profit is he truly and permanently cast into the deafening, unyielding silence of a civilian life that has absolutely no use for him. The profound trauma of a stolen childhood does not simply evaporate with age, it quietly metastasizes in the dark. The structural foundation of his entire reality, the blinding carbon arc lamps, the screaming directors, the heavy burden of carrying a family's financial survival before his 10th birthday, leaves behind a vast, echoing psychological crater. The Hollywood machinery had forcefully evicted him, but the ghosts of the soundstage refused to leave his mind. To survive the crushing weight of these memories, to navigate a reality where he is a discarded artifact of a bygone era, he desperately requires an anesthetic. The descent into substance abuse begins not with a dramatic, explosive collapse, but with a quiet, methodical surrender. In dimly lit rooms, the sharp, singular sound of ice clinking against heavy glass becomes the new, terrifying metronome of his life. Alcohol is deployed as a chemical weapon against his own brain. It is a biological attempt to drown the trademark Dickie. The amber liquid floods his nervous system, artificially recreating the false warmth and manufactured security that was once promised by smiling studio executives holding predatory contracts. He attempts to drink away the humiliating memory of the fake teeth cutting into his gums. He tries to chemically erase the terrifying echo of Archie Mayo screaming at his mother. But the collateral damage of this internal, desperate war is catastrophic. The days blur into an endless, heavy, suffocating fog. The industry prefers it this way. A former child star drinking himself into oblivion in a dark, cheap apartment is a highly convenient narrative for the studio bosses. It ensures the silence remains completely unbroken. The Hollywood system is entirely absolved of its moral and legal responsibility the exact moment the victim pulls the trigger of his own destruction. Yet before the alcohol can finish its grim work, the universe delivers a far more visceral, terrifying biological strike. The year is 1945. A quiet, insidious invasion breaches his immune system. Bypassing standard studio executive memos or canceled contracts, the next catastrophic threat manifests as a microscopic, silent, and ruthlessly efficient biological attacker. The diagnosis is infectious polyneuritis, a severe, paralyzing condition closely mimicking the devastating effects of polio. The biological betrayal is absolute and terrifying. It begins with a deep, unnatural aching in the extremities. Then comes the creeping, undeniable numbness, the vital electrical signals traveling down his spinal cord, the complex biological telegraph system that commands movement begin to misfire, scramble, and finally fall completely silent. The muscles in his legs, the exact same legs that had been forcefully dragged to taped marks on wooden floors, the legs that had danced and sprinted through meticulously crafted studio backlots to generate millions of dollars, simply refused to obey the desperate commands of his brain. He is confined to a sterile white bed in a military hospital, staring blankly up at a cracked plaster ceiling. The irony is agonizing, cutting straight to the bone. The boy who had been physically manipulated, aggressively handled, and forcefully positioned by adult directors for his entire conscious life is now entirely, literally paralyzed. He is trapped in a motionless body, a prisoner of his own failing nervous system. The rehabilitation process is a masterclass in isolated, excruciating agony. The clinic smells sharply of rubbing alcohol, boiled institutional food, and the heavy metallic scent of desperate physical exertion. The room is dominated by heavy steel parallel bars, bolted securely to a cold linoleum floor. For agonizing months, the daily routine consists of grueling, tear-inducing combat against the fundamental laws of gravity. He grips the cold steel rails, his knuckles turning a bloodless skeletal white, Sweat beads heavily on his forehead, stinging his eyes as he violently forces his damaged nerves to communicate with rapidly atrophying muscle tissue. Every single step is a monumental, exhausting negotiation with pain. He drags a deadened limb forward mere inches at a time, his breath hitching violently in his chest. In the brutal, aesthetic-driven industry he was raised in, a body that does not perform perfectly is worse than useless. It is offensive. But he is no longer fighting for a camera angle or a contract extension. He is fighting for the basic, fundamental human dignity of physical mobility. He is fighting to stand upright on his own 2 feet without the support of a stage parent, a director, or a studio boss. He slowly, agonizingly reconstructs the mechanical ability to walk. When he finally leaves the clinic, the paralysis has retreated, but it leaves behind a permanent, undeniable signature. A slight, inescapable limp, a subtle, heavy drag of the foot. It is a physical manifestation of his survival, a scar earned not on a film set, but in the brutal trenches of his own biology. This harrowing physical resurrection triggers a profound psychological awakening. The man who dragged himself out of the wheelchair refuses to be a victim. He refuses to allow the Hollywood machinery to dictate the final act of his life. He realizes that the only way to survive the narrative is to seize control of the printing press. He steps entirely away from the front of the lens. The geography shifts from the toxic nostalgia of Los Angeles to the sharp, unforgiving concrete of New York City. He surgically embeds himself into the corporate control room, establishing his own public relations firm. The transition is a masterstroke of psychological rebellion. The man whose entire early existence had been aggressively stage-managed, whose precise age had been systematically falsified by studio accountants, and whose every manufactured tear had been distributed globally via press release, has now seized the very machinery of mass manipulation. He is no longer the subject of the narrative. He is the architect. He writes the press releases. He manages the corporate crises. He utilizes the exact same psychological levers that were once used to exploit him, but he wields them with the cold, calculated, and devastating precision of an insider who knows exactly where all the bodies are buried. This reclamation of power is merely the prologue to his ultimate act of retribution. He transforms his survival into a weapon. A small, quiet room in the early 1980s. A magnetic cassette tape spins slowly inside a portable recorder. Dick Moore sits across from the surviving ghosts of his past. He spends years relentlessly tracking down his peers, the other battered survivors of the Golden Age cinematic assembly line. He knocks on doors that have been closed for decades. He sits across from Jackie Coogan, the boy who made Charlie Chaplin cry, the child who generated a massive global fortune only to discover his own parents had legally stolen every single penny. He sits with Margaret O'Brien, capturing the terror of a childhood dictated by the threat of violence. He sits with Mickey Rooney and Natalie Wood. He presses the record button, and for the very first time in Hollywood history, he gives them the absolute, unedited, uninterrupted view. He allows them to speak without a script, without a director, and without a studio publicist monitoring their words. The resulting publication, released in 1984, is titled Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, But Don't Have Sex or Take the Car. shattering the boundaries of a glossy, nostalgic Hollywood memoir filled with charming anecdotes. The resulting publication serves as a meticulously documented, aggressively investigated autopsy. It is a searing, undeniable indictment of a multi-million-dollar industry built entirely upon the legal, moral, and physical exploitation of minors. The book violently rips away the heavy velvet curtain of the Golden Age, laying completely bare the systematic financial theft, the deliberate educational neglect, the physical exhaustion, and the profound psychological abuse inherent in the studio system. He methodically documents the staggering, horrifying rates of drug addiction, bankruptcy, severe mental illness, and suicide among his childhood peers. Dick Moore does not die, a quiet, forgotten victim in a heavily mortgaged house. He rises from the ashes of his stolen childhood to become the lead prosecutor in a trial that Hollywood spent half a century desperately trying to avoid. He effectively weaponizes his own trauma, transforming his profound personal suffering into a permanent historical document. He speaks for the dead, he speaks for the broken, and he completely destroys the myth of the happy Hollywood child, ensuring that the blood on the soundstage floors can never be washed away or forgotten. September 2015. A cold, heavy front moves slowly through the dense woods of New England, stripping the leaves from the trees long before the calendar officially declares the end of summer. Inside a sterile, climate-controlled hospital room, the ambient noise of nature is completely replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical, unyielding beeping of medical monitors. The room smells of bleach, starched linen, and the quiet inevitability of the end. The medical files detailing Dickie Moore's final days do not read like a standard biological deterioration. They read like a horrifying, poetic continuation of his worst cinematic nightmares. The ultimate diagnosis written in sharp black ink on the chart is absolute and irreversible. Severe dementia. It is a uniquely cruel and deeply cynical disease. It does not initiate its attack on the physical organs. It aggressively targets the narrative. It systematically dismantles the hard drive of human identity. For a man who had spent his entire conscious existence desperately fighting to remember who he really was, who had spent decades in a grueling psychological war to separate the actual human being named John Richard Moore from the heavily trademarked fictional studio product known as Dickie, the disease is the ultimate betrayal. It violates the final sanctuary he possessed, his own mind. The clinical charts document a terrifying regression. There are extensive periods of intense, disorienting confusion. He experiences a profound, accelerating withdrawal from the physical world. The intricate neurological pathways that successfully connect complex thought to spoken language begin to misfire, degrade, and eventually snap entirely. The expansive, razor-sharp vocabulary he utilized to write his groundbreaking book, the sharp, analytical intellect he weaponized to build a New York public relations empire, evaporates silently into the cold hospital air. The silence returns. The young man who had been contractually forced to play a deaf mute on the deeply shadowed set of a cynical 1947 crime thriller was now trapped in the very real, inescapable silence of a failing neurological system. He lies motionless in the elevated hospital bed, his large, expressive eyes, the very eyes that once generated millions of dollars and dictated the emotional temperature of global audiences. Track the movement in the room. He observes the white-coated doctors checking his vitals. He watches his wife, Jane Powell, sitting quietly and holding his fragile, paper-thin hand. But the words required to express his internal terror, to articulate his profound love, or to deliver his final parting thoughts are completely gone. They are locked securely behind the impenetrable wall of a rapidly disintegrating mind. He becomes the kid once more, a silent, paralyzed witness trapped in the background of his own demise. When his physical heart finally stops beating, the machinery surrounding the bed emits a single, flat, continuous tone. There is no dramatic, sweeping orchestral climax. There is no perfectly lit close-up. There is no director yelling "cut" to release the tension in the room. There is only the cold, clinical, unromantic reality of a biological termination. The contract finally expires. The case file of Dickie Moore closes, but the machinery that built him does not power down. It merely evolves. Decades after his passing, the monolithic, iron-gated studio system that crushed his youth has fractured, decentralized, and infiltrated the domestic sphere. The physical geography of exploitation has shifted dramatically from the massive, dusty sound stages of Los Angeles into the living rooms, bedrooms, and kitchens of suburban homes across the globe. A glowing circular LED ring light illuminates a modern living room. The blinding carbon arc lamps of the 1930s have been replaced by cheap, easily accessible technology. But the fundamental predatory dynamic remains exactly the same. A mother holds a high-definition smartphone camera, pointing the lens directly at the face of a weeping toddler. The child has just dropped a toy, or scraped a knee, or experienced a moment of genuine biological distress. Instead of offering immediate comfort, instead of acting as the biological protector, shielding the child from the harshness of the world, the parent adjusts the focus. The parent checks the lighting. The parent presses record. The digital algorithm is the new faceless studio executive, and it demands constant, unyielding emotional content. The modern child star does not sign a 7-year contract with RKO or Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. They are conscripted into labor before they can speak. Their very first ultrasounds, their first steps, and their most vulnerable tantrums uploaded to servers to be consumed by millions of anonymous strangers. Dickie Moore's harrowing childhood is no longer a historical anomaly. It is a globally replicated business model. The terrifying economic inversion has returned with a vengeance. Young children, starring in daily vlogs and unboxing videos, are suddenly generating staggering ad revenue, brand deals, and sponsorships. They become the primary economic engines for their parents. The living room becomes a permanent, inescapable set where the cameras never truly stop rolling. The modern stage parent does not need an Archie Mayo to scream at their child to extract tears. They simply withhold affection, manipulate scenarios, or orchestrate highly stressful pranks to capture the highly monetizable reaction. The psychological mutilation is identical, but the modern infrastructure offers absolutely no protection. The Coogan Act, the fragile legal shield designed in the 1930s to protect the financial assets of child actors, holds zero jurisdiction over the unregulated wasteland of social media. The digital child star works unregulated hours, possesses no union representation, and has absolutely no legal claim to the millions of dollars generated by the exploitation of their own face. Furthermore, the modern erasure of identity is permanent. When Dickie Moore reached the awkward age of puberty, the studio discarded him, and he was eventually allowed to fade into the agonizing anonymity of a department store. The modern child star is denied even the mercy of being forgotten. Every single manufactured tear, every forced smile, every humiliating punishment, and every awkward phase of their physical development is permanently etched into the digital bedrock of the internet. They are trapped in a global panopticon, forced to carry the crushing weight of their monetized childhood forever. When they reach their own expiration date, when the algorithm tires of their aging faces and pivots to a newer, younger commodity, they will be discarded into a world that already possesses an exhaustive searchable archive of their deepest vulnerabilities. Operating far beyond a tragic, isolated footnote in the dusty archives of classic cinema, the documented history of Dickie Moore serves as a vital, bleeding blueprint. He was the canary in the coal mine of the entertainment industrial complex. The Hollywood machine proved with terrifying efficiency that childhood could be successfully commodified, stripped of its protective barriers, and sold for parts. The silence that defined Dickie Moore's life, the silence of the 11-month-old infant on the set, the silence of the discarded teenager, the cinematic silence of the noir witness, and the final tragic silence of the hospital room, was ultimately broken by his own hand when he published his indictment of the system. He refused to die as a quiet victim. He utilized his trauma to construct a glaring, undeniable warning sign for future generations. The tragedy lies in the blinding glow of the modern screens, proving that the world consumed the entertainment, applauded the performances, and completely ignored the warning. The cameras are smaller now, the lights run cooler, but the absolute devastating price of the manufactured illusion remains exactly the same. The machinery still requires blood to operate, and innocence remains the most lucrative currency on the market.